Hi, I'm Eric Siegel with ericstrains.com, and today we're going to take a look at the new 3-rail O-scale Pennsy GG-1 Express Freight Set from MTH. So here we have the beautiful MTH Pennsy GG-1 Freight Set. I'm going to talk about the engine first, and then after that we'll get into the pieces of rolling stock. I am by no means an expert on the GG-1, but I am going to start off with a brief history, and then after that we'll get into the MTH rendition of the GG-1. So the GG-1 is an electric locomotive that owes its streamlined design to famous industrial designer Raymond Loewy, and they were built for the Pennsy by GE between 1934 and 1943. A total of 139 GG-1s were constructed, and they were in service for a very long time. They survived the Pennsy, the Penn Central, Conrail, and Amtrak, and the last one was retired by New Jersey Transit in 1983. So these things operated for a very long time, and that's one of the reasons that they are one of the most famous electric locomotives in American railroading. If you're unfamiliar with the GG-1s, you may wonder why they were called GG-1s. Well, GG refers to the wheel arrangement on the locomotive. Basically, the way that the GG-1s were built was that it was a frame that consisted of two halves that were joined by a ball and socket joint. And so on each frame you had a 460 locomotive, and there were two of them. So essentially what you had was a 460064 locomotive. Now under the Pennsy classification for engines, a 460 was known as a Type G, and since you had two of them back to back here, it became known as a GG, and that's where they got the name GG-1. Now, not only is the GG-1 one of the most famous electric locomotives in American railroading, but it's also a very famous locomotive in O-gauge railroading because of the great post-war GG-1s that Lionel started making in 1947. It's one of the most desirable models that Lionel made in the post-war period, and so for that reason, it's sort of a rite of passage that if you're doing O-gauge railroading, you sort of have to eventually get a GG-1 in your fleet just because of the popularity and the history of the locomotive. Now, this is the first electric locomotive in my fleet, and so I think it's fitting that it's a GG-1. So now let's take a look at MTH's rendition of the GG-1 and the GG-1 freight set. The freight set that you see here, as well as the individual GG-1s, were last made available in MTH's 2013 Volume 1 catalog, and they started shipping in late 2013, early 2014, somewhere around there. They offered the freight set that you see here that comes with the Brunswick Green single stripe GG-1, and then they also offered 5 individual GG-1s. There are 2 Brunswick Green versions, a 5-stripe and a single stripe. The single stripe is a different row number than the one in the freight set. They also offered a silver solid stripe version, and then 2 of the Tuscan versions, a 5-stripe and a single stripe. So no matter what kind of GG-1 you're looking for, chances are they made it. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, when it comes to MTH engines, it's always best to get the set if it's available and if you can't afford it, because you get the most for your money when you buy the set. The difference between the individual GG-1 and the set is only $100. So for an extra $100, you get 5 pieces of Premier Line rolling stock. That is a fantastic deal. The only downside to buying the set versus the individual GG-1, if you want to call it a downside, is that the set comes with the single stripe GG-1, and I know that the 5-stripe GG-1 is generally more popular, but to me, the deal that you get with the set sort of offsets that anyway, so my recommendation is to buy the set because that will give you the most for your money. I'll talk more about the price of this set at the end of this review, but for now, let's go over some stats and facts on the engine. The length of the GG-1 is 20 inches. The weight is 7 pounds 13 ounces. It has 2 pounds 3 ounces of pulling power, and the minimum curve needed to operate this engine is 0.72. This model features all metal construction, so the body, the trucks, the pilots, and the couplers are all die-cast metal. The frame and the pantographs up top are metal as well. There's very little plastic on this model. I think maybe the clear plastic inserts in the windows and the headlights are about the only plastic items you'll find on this model. The pantographs up top are functional in two senses. First of all, they automatically move up and down depending on the direction of the engine, and they are also functional in that you can actually power the engine using the pantographs if you happen to have a catenary system on your layout, which is pretty cool. I'll talk more about the pantographs in just a few minutes. On the inside, the engine is powered by two flywheel motors, and there's also a fan-driven smoke unit. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The engine comes equipped with ProtoSound 3.0 and the MTH digital command system. There's also a DCC decoder on board. However, since this is a three-rail model, you're probably not going to have much use for DCC. There are three ways to operate this engine. The preferred method is to use MTH's digital command system, or DCS. However, you can also operate the engine conventionally with just a transformer and some track, or you can operate it with DCC. But again, because this is a three-rail model, you're probably not going to be running this thing with DCC. The MTH GG-1 is loaded with great details and features, so now let's go in for a closer look. Here's a look at the front pilot and the lead truck on the GG-1. At first glance, I thought that the pilot was a bit bland. I thought that maybe all of these details were cast in, but it turns out they're not. There is a separately applied coupler cut bar up here, and then there are several separately applied hoses on either side of the coupler. And of course, the coupler is an MTH proto coupler that can be fired from the DCS remote. And then on the lead truck here, you can see we've got some nicely detailed side frames. Back behind the lead truck is one of the two six-wheel drive trucks, and as you can see, the side frames are very nicely done. If we tilt it back a bit, you can see the great job they did on these drive wheels. They've got nice spokes and silver rims. The middle set of drive wheels lacks the wheel flanges that you have on the outer two sets, and that's to allow the engine to negotiate tighter turns, but it's done in a very good way. It's not like one of those hokey plastic blind wheel sets you see on diesels sometimes. It's very well done so that when you lay it back down, you can't even tell, and it looks great. Moving back, we've got the second six-wheel drive truck and then the rear truck, or the lead truck, depending on how you're running the engine, and these two trucks are exactly the same as the two you've already seen. Moving up, let's take a look at the front of the engine, and by the way, the front and the rear of the GG-1 are identical, but the way you tell which end is the actual front is by the presence of this little F here. F stands for front. Anyway, right up here we've got some separately applied hoses, and then above that we've got a separately applied hinged deck plate that drops down like that. And then above that, we've got some separately applied metal springs. There's an operating headlight right here, and then operating marker lights and lighted number boards on either side. Moving down the side of the engine, we've got the nice single stripe that runs down the entire length of the engine. And then we've got these nice see-through metal screens. There's one on this side, and then there's one on the other side at the opposite end. Moving back to the front cab on the GG-1, right here there's a separately applied windshield wiper on the front window, and there's one on the other side as well. On all of the cab windows on the GG-1, you'll find two separately applied metal bars. On the engineer side of each of the two cabs, the window is open and there's a hand-painted crew figure on the inside. The interiors of each of the two cabs are illuminated, and that light does turn off when the engine starts moving. And then right here we've got this nice looking door. There are 4 doors on the GG-1. On each side of the door there's a separately applied metal grab iron, there's a metal ladder leading up to the door, and all 4 of the doors open up like that, and they are sprung, so they will snap shut like that. As we swing around a bit, we can get a view of the rear cab, which is identical to the front cab, but since we're looking at the fireman's side of the rear cab, there is no open window and there is no crew figure sitting inside. However, if we were to rotate around and look at the engineer side of the rear cab, there would be a crew figure and an open window. In between the two cabs on the GG-1, on each side, you'll find a beautiful crisp Pennsy logo. There are some nice cast-in details on either side of the logo, and then we've got 2 see-through vents. As we come around to the back side of the GG-1, you can see that the back is almost identical to the front. There are only a couple minor differences. One of them is that the marker lights back here are red instead of green. And then, of course, because this is the rear of the GG-1, you don't have that little F down here like you do up front. Let's take a look at the top of the GG-1. Starting up front, we've got this little hinged metal plate that comes up like that. And then behind it, we've got the front pantograph. Now, because this is the front of the engine, at least right now, this pantograph is down and the rear pantograph is up. If we were to change directions, that would reverse. This one would come up and the other one would go down. That's how these things work. The pantograph that is elevated and in contact with the catenary system, if you have one, is the pantograph that is at whatever end is the rear of the engine. Now, I'm going to go into more detail about how these pantographs work, but I'm going to wait until I show you the rear pantograph, because right now the rear pantograph is elevated, and that makes it a little bit easier to show you how these things work. Moving back behind the pantograph, there's a separately applied metal horn right here. And then back here, we've got the steam stack with a fan-driven smoke unit down inside. Now, in this case, the smoke unit is not meant to simulate exhaust, but rather it's meant to simulate steam, because the GG-1s had oil-fired steam generators on board for heating purposes, and occasionally they would have to release some of that steam. And so for that reason, there are two steam release functions on this model that can be activated from the DCS remote. They look pretty cool, and you'll see them in action in just a couple minutes when we start this thing up. Here we are at what is currently the rear of the engine. There's another separately applied metal horn right here. And then on the end, we've got another hinged metal plate. And in the middle, we've got the rear pantograph that is currently elevated. Now, I mentioned earlier that not only are these pantographs operational in that they automatically raise and lower depending on the direction of the engine, but they're also operational in that you can power the engine off of these pantographs if you're lucky enough to have a catenary system on your layout. And the way that works is that on the underside of the engine, there's a toggle switch that goes between center rail power and pantograph power. You still need the outer rails of your 3-rail track to get the common, but when you switch it to pantograph power, you draw the center rail hot from the pantograph instead of the center rail. So what's really cool about that is that if you have a layout that is modeling all electric locomotives, if you wanted to, you could actually remove the center rollers on this engine and use 2-rail track and power the engine using the pantographs and your catenary system. And that's really cool. Now, unfortunately, you can't power the engine on both the pantograph and the center rail at the same time. It's one or the other. I'm not exactly sure why they did it like that, but knowing MTH, I'm sure there was a good reason. Anyway, there's another switch on the underside of the engine that also involves the pantographs, and that switch allows you to completely deactivate the pantographs so that they do not automatically go up and down when the engine changes direction. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, I can think of one reason right off the bat. If you're running the GG-1 on a layout that does not have a catenary system like mine, you may have bridges or tunnels that do not have the necessary clearance to allow this tall pantograph to get through. And so you don't want to run the engine under those bridges or through those tunnels and have the pantograph get torn off. So what you would do in that case is deactivate the pantographs with that switch on the underside, and then there's a tab right here, and if you push down, it'll lock the pantograph in the down position, and then there's no chance that it can pop back up and get damaged by any low-hanging bridges or tunnels. Now, if the need arises, you can actually detach the pantographs from the engine. So if while you're handling it, you accidentally knock one of the pantographs off, don't freak out. They can actually be detached and reattached. The way you do it is there's a locking tab right here. And so if you pull up gently, it comes off like that. And now with the pantograph detached, I can show you how they work. There are two tabs down here, and the raising and lowering of the pantograph has to do with these tabs. If you squeeze on them, it comes down, and if you release, there are springs up here on top that pull it back to the elevated position. And then on the engine, there are 2 slots. And inside those 2 slots, there's a sort of scissor mechanism. And so when the pantograph needs to be lowered, that scissor mechanism closes and squeezes those tabs. And then when the pantograph needs to come back up, that scissor mechanism releases and the springs pull it back up. And that's all there is to it. So when you want to reattach the pantograph to the engine, I find it's easiest to do it if the pantograph is in the elevated mode. And all you do is just stick the tabs back in those slots, like that, and then center the pantograph over that little locking tab, push down, and that's all there is to it. Here's a look at the underside of the GG-1. There are 2 pickup rollers, one here and one here. And that actually surprised me a little bit because on an engine of this size, you would normally expect at least 4 pickup rollers, but I guess MTH knows what they're doing because I have not had any connectivity issues running this engine. There are a number of switches and knobs on the underside. There's a switch right here that toggles between DCS and DCC control, but as I said earlier, DCC control is sort of a moot point with this model because it's a 3-rail model. There's a switch over here that toggles between center rail power and pantograph power. There's another switch over here that activates or deactivates the pantographs. And then there are 2 adjustment knobs back here. One adjusts the smoke volume and one is the master audio volume. Okay, that does it for the engine. Now let's take a look at the rolling stock that comes with the GG-1 freight set. There are 4 boxcars and 1 caboose in the set. This is one of the 4 boxcars, and as you can see, it looks great. It's got a beautiful, crisp paint job. There are die-cast metal sprung trucks and couplers as usual. There's a separately applied brake wheel right here with a metal chain underneath. There are separately applied ladders and grab irons on every side of the car. The roof is very well done, and there are separately applied metal grab irons on each end. And the underside is also very well done, as you can see. And then, of course, the doors on the boxcar open up like that. So, in other words, this is a typical piece of MTH Premier Line rolling stock. For those of you who already own some MTH rolling stock, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And for those who don't, in a nutshell, it means it's very high quality, very well made. Here's a look at the caboose that comes with the set. It's also very well done. Typical MTH, die-cast metal sprung trucks and couplers, a great paint job, lots of separately applied metal grab irons. It's got operating marker lights on this end. The interior is detailed and illuminated, and there's a hand-painted crew figure up in the cupola. Okay, the last thing we're going to do before we start this thing up is BF-IMO, best feature in my opinion. Well, I'm going to go with the obvious on this one and pick the operating pantographs. They're just really cool. They really get a lot of attention when people see the engine in action. And what's neat is that they don't just operate up and down, but they actually function. You can use a catenary system if you want to. And that makes them even better in my opinion. And the mechanism that makes the pantographs go up and down is actually relatively simple, so it's a very well-designed system, and it just really adds a whole lot to the model. So my pick for BF-IMO is the operating pantographs. We're ready to start the engine up and take the set for a spin. I'm going to be running the set on the upper level of track today because I want to make sure that the pantographs don't get damaged by any of my tunnels. Now, of course, I don't have a catenary system on my layout right now, so we're just going to have to use our imaginations. Okay, let's go ahead and start this thing up.
If you're ready to go, shoot, springs and pads, check out, okay. Yep, she's in good shape.
Okay, first up, let's check out the horn. And now let's check out the bell. Okay, now let's check out the pantographs in action. As I said, the elevated pantograph is always the rear pantograph. So since this is the front of the engine, the rear one is elevated. Let's change directions and see what happens. Pretty cool. And let's do it again. Not bad at all. Now let's check out the steam release sequences. There are two sequences that can be accessed using the DCS remote. There's FBS and FPR on these soft keys. Let's check out FBS first. That's a quick burst of steam. And now let's check out FPR, which is a pressure release sequence. Pretty cool. Okay, let's go ahead and roll it out, and in a minute or two, I'll stop it and do the passenger freight announcement sequence. Okay, now we're going to check out the passenger freight announcement sequence.
Today. soon.
Okay, that about wraps it up for this review. This is a fantastic set, and the best part about it is the price. The retail price on the GG-1 by itself is right at $800, and that's a good deal. But it gets even better. I've said this before, but when it comes to MTH, if you can, it's always best to get the set, because for a mere $100 more, you get the 4 boxcars and the caboose. So for a retail price of $900, you get the GG-1, the 4 boxcars, and the caboose. That is a great deal, and that's the retail price. If you go through a good MTH dealer, you can probably get a little bit of a discount off that retail price and make it even better. And as always, if you're looking for a good MTH dealer, try my favorite train store, which is Legacy Station. You can find them on the web at www.legacystation.com, or give them a call at 770-339-7780. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Eric Siegel, and I'll see you next time. To discuss this model or any other O-Gauge trains and to meet other O-Gauge modelers, check out the O-Gauge Railroading Magazine online forum at ogrforum.ogaugerr.com. There's a little locking tab right here, and so you just grab it on each side like that and gently pull up. Ooh. Like that.